So it's a real pleasure for us to have Tim Jackson giving us a view that we need to hear, and I think the economic dimensions are often glossed over, and Dr. Jackson is going to hit it straight on. So Tim, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to Washington and to your conference. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it may seem, I mean, and it struck me, to be perfectly honest, as a somewhat inopportune time to come exactly to here in DC and talk about the idea of an economy without growth. Because it isn't certainly the most popular vision for economics in the current climate. But it might be comforting to know that it wasn't ever the most popular vision in economics. And in fact, when I launched this report initially to my own government, to the UK government, as Economics Commissioner on the Sustainable Development Commission, I was met with something that could usefully be described as a mixture of wrath and disbelief. And 2 years later, the Commission no longer existed. So it's not been a popular message. It still isn't a popular message. But my argument to you, in a way, is that it is a message that is even more important than it has ever been. And I want to just rehearse very briefly some of the reasons for that, and then give you, in a nutshell, in a very short space of time, just a flavor of where I go from the position of realizing that a growth-based economy is not something that we can rely on inevitably in the future. But let me just rehearse a couple of those reasons why not. Here is a really interesting graph, particularly to health and environment professionals. This is a graph of life expectancy at birth against income per capita. And it shows quite an extraordinary story, really, which is that growth actually really matters in the poorest economies. So where income is less than $10,000 or $15,000 per capita, and as you increase that level of income, you can almost double the life expectancy. It really does work to increase people's incomes in the poorest economies in the world. And you can do this same graph with infant mortality, with maternal morbidity, with participation in education, and you find exactly the same pattern. Where growth is needed is in the poorest countries of the world, amongst the poorest people in the world. That's where it matters to increase income. And then after a certain point, you see that line tails off. There's a kind of diminishing returns to growth. And in fact, it's kind of worse than that, because if you look at the USA, the UK, Ireland, for example, you find they have life expectancies which are lower than Costa Rica, Chile, Cuba, for example, on a fraction of the income. In other words, what this graph kind of tells us is that maybe if we organized our society differently, if we invested differently, we had different forms of governance, if we cared about inequality, we could get much better health outcomes, much better real prosperity than we are currently able to do in the most advanced economies in the world. But there also, of course, is a challenge. Why is it then that the richest countries in the world are continuing to pursue growth? And I'll come back to some of the reasons for that, some of which are structural. But I want to point out, obviously, that on a finite planet, if you take this sort of data seriously and you recognize that there are limited resources, limited space on the planet, if you wanted to maximize human well-being on such a small planet, you would certainly distribute the growth, the income, to the poorest first and not to the richest. And the challenge to the richest is to find a different economics, a different kind of system that would allow that to happen meaningfully. And here, in a nutshell, is the evidence in relation to the ecological issue. So, as some of you here at least hopefully will know, that the Paris Agreement in November 2015 set out a very, very precise aspiration to reduce carbon emissions to a level consistent with 1.5 degrees warming above the pre-industrial average. That is a huge target. It was a huge step forward. And it exists now as at least today, it still exists as a political agreement. But the challenge, the technological challenge, the economic challenge of achieving that is huge. Because at our current level of emission, the available carbon to burn runs out in less than a decade. And beyond that, we have to discover, invent, implement technologies to take carbon out of the atmosphere rather than pump carbon into the atmosphere. So there's a very clear message there that in the process of developing our economics, we're running out of planet. We may not yet quite be running out of oil or other resources, but the idea that we're running out of planet is a very powerful one. Now, all of that, all of those messages are messages that in a company like this are broadly well understood, well accepted, but amongst mainstream economists are virtually untouched, sometimes disbelieved, and very often not confronted. But in the interim, between when I first wrote this report for government and the second edition, which David showed you a copy of just now, really interesting things have happened in the economy. And one of those things that has happened is the understanding that there may actually be secular limits to growth, not just environmental ones. This is a picture, and it's a picture of the UK, but the situation in the US is not massively different, of what's called labour productivity growth over the period from 1900 to 2015. And what you discover is that the affluence that was built in advanced nations was built through this labour productivity growth, through technology, of course, very much on the rise up until about the mid-1960s, mid to late 1960s. And since the mid-1960s, it has been on the decline again. And what's striking about this is that the economic woes, the secular stagnation, the difficulty in getting growth back again is not, as many people think, simply a question of the financial crisis. It's not an arbitrary business cycle in which the banks lost confidence, people lost their homes, businesses went out of business, people lost their jobs. It was not an arbitrary fluctuation in that cycle. It was an underlying secular trend arising from long-term changes in the nature of the economy. And actually in the UK, what's really interesting is that labour productivity growth was negative just a year or so ago, and that trend started in the 1960s. In other words, there's beginning to be a realization amongst conventional economists that a growth-based economics may not be the way of the future. Now, that's a pretty scary place to be for all of us, because we built our economies and built our societies around that idea that they will be growing forever, and to actually confront the reasons why they may not grow forever, and the challenge of creating a low growth or perhaps even a no growth economics is exactly what I, in the Sustainable Development Commission, my colleagues at the University of Surrey, our collaborators across the world, have begun to develop. The idea that actually we could usefully think of an economics that isn't based on relentless growth, isn't based on the idea that ultimately this happens. This was in the middle of the riots in London in 2011, a direct response to the financial crisis. It was replicated across a number of countries in Europe. It was mirrored in the Occupy movement here in the UK. It was a sense of social unrest arising out of a broken economic model. And the dimensions of that broken economic model are now very well rehearsed. The idea of work and employment as a form of servitude, investments as pure speculation, a kind of casino economy, enterprise as simply forms of accumulation, either of material stuff or of profit and of capital, and money as a power structure dominated by the influence of a minority. In other words, the privatization of gains and the socialization of losses is a really accurate way to describe exactly what went on through the crisis. The architects of the crisis, often in the financial sector, rewarded by the bailouts from the public sector, from taxation that we ordinary people, sometimes the poorest in society, will be paying for decades. This is a broken model, an economy that doesn't work. Surely we could do a little better than that. And my starting point really is to take each of those factors, work, enterprise, investment, money, and say, how would they work? How would they create an economy that does work? How could we build from first principles, from economic first principles, a set of ideas that could rescue us from this impasse, that could give us a better vision for a future economics? Where do we start? Let's simply start with work. Work is more than just the means to a livelihood. It is ultimately a form of participation in society. It's how we can express our own creativity in society, our contribution to that society, our service to others, in principle. Of course, the reality is very, very different, particularly in Europe after the crisis. There was 50% youth unemployment, half of a whole generation with no prospects whatsoever for participating in this meaningful way in society. And that is not just a tragedy, it's an entirely preventable tragedy, because that labor is a resource into the economy and needs to be recognized as that, rewarded as that, and deployed as that. The economist Hyman Minsky had a very interesting idea. He argued that government actually is employer of last resort. When the economy fails to employ people, it is the role of the state to ensure that there's a meaningful participation in labor for everyone who wishes to participate in that way. And that's not to suggest that it's simply paid labor or that the labor market as we know it is something that should be propped up, but it is to suggest that this idea of work as participation, rather than an arbitrary division of labor for the interests of the owners of capital, is the starting point for a different way of thinking about work. And there are very interesting things about this new vision, because it's a place that's rich, for example, in the participation of women. So the care sector, for example, is employment rich. Creativity, the creativity sector and cultural sector is also a place which is employment rich. Craftsmanship is a place where you can absorb hours and hours of people's time to make solid, well-worked, well-crafted, beautiful things that will last over time. And if you think about each of these things, each of these activities, care and craft and culture, they all have one characteristic, that they are about the investment of our time in the service of others, in the service of something that lasts. And that idea of enterprise as service takes us towards the second of my foundations for the economy of tomorrow. That idea of service through health and education, through social care, through refurbishment, through renovation, through transforming the housing stock, through building green spaces, through protecting ecosystem assets, is incredibly labor-rich. What that means, what does that mean? It means that that indicator that I showed you of low labor productivity growth is no longer dominating the economy, it's actually transforming the economy, because those are the sectors in which human time matters, in which our application of our resources as human beings in the care and service of others begins to build an economy that works. Again, a vision that would transform the way that we think about enterprise, and not a million miles from things that are already happening, often at small scale, often at community level, often unsupported, but there as the seeds of a transformation of our economy and of our economics. None of this can happen, of course, without investment. And here there's also a transformation, a very simple transformation of seeing investment as the most important relationship in economics. It's been seen over the last 20 years in particular as a form of speculation, as a kind of casino economy, betting on our own future, betting on commodity prices, betting on the kind of casino economy, betting on our own future, betting on commodity prices, betting on the value of assets, borrowing money in order that finance can finance itself. Finance finances finance, rather than the building of a real economy. And that was precisely one of the reasons behind the crash in 2000 and 2008 and 2009. And it is not inevitable. It is the basis of institutional structures that incentivized that behavior and prevented investment in clean technology, in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in the services that we need to create that service-based economy, in the ecological assets that we need to provide the foundation for any kind of prosperity. Making that work is a lot of the work that I do with investors at every level, at institutional level, at venture capital investment level, at community investment level, transforming that structure of investment, making it work for society. What makes it hardest to do that is a very, very simple thing: the role and the nature of money. So what is surprising when you put money on the table is how deep our misunderstanding of it goes. Henry Ford once said, it's as well that people don't know the nature of the money system, because I think if they did, there would be a revolution before the morning. And the nature of that money system is that over 90% in most economies, close to 100% of money is created at commercial interest-bearing debt by private interests. It's not in the control of governments. It has no sovereign control over it, virtually very little sovereign control over it. There's a theory, a complex theory, which suggests that governments can tweak that by changing interest rates. It failed spectacularly through the crisis. And there is now an emerging understanding that we need a different sense of the economics of money, money as a social good. And to replace that generation of money through interest-bearing debt with a real sovereign money system, which allows states to invest in all of the things that I've spoken about in health and social care and education, creating the welfare that we need to make our economies work. 4 very simple foundations: workers' participation, enterprise as service, investment as a commitment to the future, money as a social good. Could we create such an economy of care, craft, and culture? If we could, it would be an enormous transformation of our society. To do so, and this is the last little bit that I'll tease you through, as an insight into some of what's in the book, we need to create what I've begun to call a post-growth economics, a macroeconomics of post-growth, because our macroeconomics since Keynes has relied on the idea that consumption will expand more or less relentlessly. What if we had an economy that didn't do that? A colleague, long-standing colleague who I'm going to visit in Virginia after this conference, Herman Daly, once talked about a steady state economics. Is that at all possible? Can we think of a macroeconomics built around that? What would it look like? Well, here's, if you like, a picture of a steady state economy, and it looks, of course, as though nothing much really is happening. I've modeled it simply as absolutely nothing happening, and that would never be the case. So all the interesting questions arise when something changes from that steady state, and whether we're able to control an economy to give it stability through those kinds of changes and disruptions. So myself and a couple of colleagues have been working on this idea, working with systems models, and here is just one very simple experiment that came out of that. Suppose we took this steady state and we shocked it out. Would it then go completely wild, or could it return to its equilibrium? And in our base case, yes, very nicely it returns to equilibrium. But we can shock it out of that state. We can ask it, for example, to respond to the animal spirits of mad investors who invest masses when the market's going well and then withdraw investment completely when it looks like it's crashing. What would happen if you put those kinds of investors in this kind of shock? Well, not surprisingly, it does destabilize it. And in fact, this red line, if you take it far enough, will simply crash the whole system. Now, here was a really interesting thing. We thought, well, how can you actually address that? Who can address that? And post-Keynesian economics in particular has argued that the state has an absolutely vital role in addressing that kind of instability. And this is the effect of it. You ask the state to spend counter-cyclically into that fluctuation and you calm the whole thing down. So this idea, actually, that there is a massively important role for the state in stabilizing a post-growth economics takes us further towards the idea, perhaps, that we can envision a progressive state, a state that is not bound by the split between government and market, a state that operates entrepreneurially, a state that takes seriously the idea of investment, that invests first and foremost in sovereign money, and that is able to take an active role in the well-being of its citizens. Now, of course, I don't need you to tell me, but I'm sure many of you would like to. This is about as far away from the version of state that we're moving into, particularly in this country, as we could get. But is it necessarily so? My argument that it's not. But in order to assure that it's not, we have to begin to build these foundations in the way that I've started to set out, systematically thinking and rethinking economics and the role of enterprise and work and investment and the money system. Ultimately, the argument is a very, very, very simple one. As human beings, the idea of a huge and relentless throughput of more and more material stuff is profoundly mistaken. It doesn't speak to either the stability of the economy or the health of the planet, or the integrity of communities, or even our own psychology, our own desires as human beings. Prosperity transcends material concerns. It is about the pursuit of meaning. It's about a sense of identity. It's about our participation in society. It's about our ability to flourish on a finite planet. And my commitment and my sense of this agenda in the years since I first wrote that report for the UK government back in 2008, it is an idea whose time has come. It is more relevant than it has ever been and is not in the least inaccessible. It is about building those structures and those foundations from the bottom up, if necessary, to create the foundations for change. Thank you very much for your attention.
The first one I will summarize shortly, which is how do we get there from here? And how do we operationalize the idea, those who are academics, those who are in business, those who are in government?
Absolutely vital question, of course, really important, and there is no single answer to it. There is a variety of answers, and it depends who you are. If you are an academic, and many of you will already be working in areas which are related to this, in the care professions, in environment, in bringing evidence to government, then that is exactly what you should be doing. But there are also, of course, grassroots movements for change, building these communities from the bottom up, building these ideas from the bottom up, and there is, I would argue, a case, particularly in the current climate, for a sense of activism to take those ideas into and through policy, to create a policy environment that is receptive to this idea of change. And within government, actually, I mean, this was the process that I started in 2000, that we started as the Commission in 2007, 2008. It was exactly a painstaking process of asking questions, deep questions. Why does the institutional structure of the financial sector not just inhibit, but sometimes prohibit the reasonable behavior of decent ethical investment? Why does it favor speculation, casino speculation, over an investment in the assets of society? Those are all when you get down to them, there are minutiae of policy detail that allow you to change the investment infrastructure. And ultimately, of course, as individuals, although we can't change the world, we can always change something in the way that we interact with that world, and that too is a resource for change.
We've got two questions that are asking similar things, which are relating to the metrics. So roles of ecological economics, ecosystem service, valuation, accounting for externalities and commodities and services. So the nuts and bolts of how do you do this in the economics language?
Yeah, and the typical response in economics, and I've come across it a lot, is to say that the market works when you get the prices right, and therefore the thing you have to do is to get the prices right. Adjust the prices of these natural commodities and ecological assets, internalize them in the market in the language of that particular approach, and you'll fix everything. Now, from my point of view, there is a partial truth in that and a partial difficulty. And the partial truth is that these things do have value. So one of my colleagues, Robert Costanza, for example, did some work some time ago showing that the value of nature's assets to society is of the same order as the productive capacity of the economy as a whole. It's not a minute adjustment. It's of the same order of the financial flows that go through the economy. The value of biodiversity, of the soil, of honeybees in creating pollination, all of these values which go completely unrecognized. So do we need to find some mechanism for internalizing them? Yes, of course we do. Does that mean that we entirely commoditize nature, or that in itself is sufficient? My own sense of that is that it is not sufficient, and that there are dangers in a totally commodified approach to the internalization of economic value. But that's not to say that the approach itself is without any value at all.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tim. We do have a couple more questions, and I'll just give them to you so that you know what people are asking. And if you're one of the people that ask them, I encourage you to catch Tim, not immediately, but after our next session. And I would like to invite our next session discussants to come right up and take your chairs, because we don't have a break. We're going to come right away. And let's thank Tim.